Sardinia has the highest concentration of male centenarians on Earth. That fact has been documented, studied, and cited enough that most people who follow longevity research have heard it. What fewer people know is that the Sardinian advantage does not begin in adulthood. It does not begin at middle age, when the dietary habits that produce it are already decades old. It begins in the first 6 years of a child's life, in a set of food restrictions that Sardinian grandmothers in the Barbagia region of Nuoro province have maintained across generations. Restrictions that modern neurodevelopmental research is now confirming were, without any scientific framework to name them, precisely correct. Here is the contrast that opens the question. In the United States, children between the ages of 2 and 5 consume an average of 56 grams of added sugar per day, according to data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, published in 2021. The American Heart Association's recommended maximum for children in that age group is 25 grams. The average American toddler consumes more than double the recommended ceiling every day during the exact developmental window when the prefrontal cortex is undergoing its most rapid period of structural organization. In traditional Sardinian households in the Barbagia, specifically the inland mountain villages of Oliena, Orgosolo, and Arezzo, which have been the primary subject of longevity research since Dr. Gianni and Dr. Michel Poulin's work in the early 2000s. Children under the age of 6 are not given refined sugar at all, not reduced sugar, not occasional sugar as a treat, none. Not because the families cannot afford it, not because the tradition predates sugar's availability. The restriction is active, intentional, and enforced by the grandmothers who, in Sardinian family structure, hold specific and recognized authority over what young children eat. It is not genes. We know that because Sardinian emigrants to the Italian mainland and to Australia, who adopt Western dietary patterns within one generation, including the feeding of their children, do not produce the same developmental or longevity outcomes. The advantage moves with the practice, not the DNA. It is not poverty or simplicity. The Barbagia villages have had access to processed foods for decades. The restriction is a choice. So what are these grandmothers actually doing to the developing brain? And why does it matter that it happens before age 6 specifically? The prefrontal cortex is the region of the brain responsible for executive function, impulse control, emotional regulation, sustained attention, and the capacity to delay reward in favor of longer-term outcomes. Every behavioral capability that parents of school-age children spend years trying to develop in their children, the ability to sit still, to focus, to manage frustration, to choose the harder right thing over the easier wrong one, is governed by this region. What is less commonly understood is that the prefrontal cortex develops in windows, not continuously. The first and most structurally significant window runs from approximately 18 months to 6 years of age. During this period, the neural connections being laid down are not fixed permanently, but they are disproportionately influential. The patterns established in this window become the baseline architecture that all later development builds on. Here is what dietary sugar does to that architecture. A 2020 study published in Translational Psychiatry, examining dietary patterns and prefrontal cortex development in children aged 2 through 7, found that high consumption of added sugar in early childhood was associated with measurably reduced grey matter volume in the prefrontal and orbitofrontal cortical regions, the precise areas governing impulse control and reward-based decision-making. The effect was not subtle. Children in the highest quartile of early sugar consumption showed structural differences in these regions compared to children in the lowest quartile, differences that remained detectable at age 7, independent of other dietary variables. The mechanism is not mysterious. Added sugar, specifically fructose and refined glucose at the quantities consumed in Western early childhood diets, triggers repeated, high-amplitude spikes in dopamine release in the developing brain. Dopamine is the brain's signal for reward salience. When that signal fires at high amplitude repeatedly during the prefrontal development window, the brain begins calibrating its reward threshold around those amplitudes. Activities that produce lower dopamine responses, sustained reading, patient problem solving, creative play without immediate payoff, register as less rewarding relative to the calibrated baseline. Not because the child is deficient, because the baseline was set high. Sardinian grandmothers in the Barbagia never read Translational Psychiatry. They describe the restriction in different language. The phrase used across multiple family oral tradition interviews documented by Italian cultural anthropologist Dolores Turchi is roughly translated as, "Children should not be given things that make them want more things." The mechanism they named is not neurological, but the mechanism they identified is. The practical application of this first layer is not complicated and not extreme. It does not require zero sugar indefinitely. It requires restraint during a specific window. Here is what that looks like in practice applied to a modern household. For children under 6, remove added sugar from daily eating entirely. Not from birthday cakes or grandparent visits, from the daily architecture of meals and snacks. Read labels on foods marketed specifically to children, because added sugar appears in products most parents do not expect it in. Crackers, pasta sauce, yogurt, bread, cereal that is not labelled as sweet. Replace those products with whole food equivalents. Sweeten nothing that is not already sweet. Allow fruit freely. The fructose in whole fruit is delivered with fiber that significantly slows absorption and blunts the dopamine spike. The restriction is about added, refined sugar, not about sweetness as a category. The most common error in applying this is exception creep. Every individual exception seems harmless. The cumulative effect of daily small exceptions is that the restriction exists in theory and not in practice. Traditional Sardinian grandmother enforcement of this rule is not negotiable and is not subject to the child's preference or protest. That rigidity, which can feel harsh to modern parents, is structurally the point. This is where the Sardinian system diverges from simple dietary restriction, and where the developmental outcome exceeds what the restriction alone would produce. The prefrontal cortex development window is not only damaged by the wrong inputs, it is built by the right ones. The Sardinian grandmothers do not remove sugar and leave a gap. They fill the gap with something that most modern children's food environments have eliminated almost entirely. Complex, low-reward sensory experience that requires patience to appreciate. The traditional early childhood diet in the Barbagia region consists primarily of what the families call il cibo degli anziani, the food of the elderly. Minestrone made with the vegetables currently in season. Whole grain pane carasau, the traditional flatbread with no spread. Pecorino cheese in small amounts. Legume soups. Fresh seasonal fruit. Bitter greens, particularly cicoria, wild chicory, which Sardinian children in the Barbagia eat from approximately age 3 onward, and which has a pronounced bitter flavour that most Western children are never exposed to before school age. The bitterness is not incidental. It is, in the context of developmental neuroscience, functionally important. Research from the Monell Chemical Senses Center in Philadelphia, specifically a 2017 study examining flavor preference formation and reward learning in children aged 2 through 8, found that early repeated exposure to bitter and complex flavors during the sensory development window produces measurable changes in taste receptor expression and in the brain's hedonic processing of food. Children exposed to bitter and complex flavors before age 5 not only accept those flavors more readily throughout childhood and adulthood, they develop a fundamentally different hedonic baseline for food reward. The high-amplitude dopamine response that characterizes sugar consumption does not, for these children, represent the only available food-based pleasure. They have been taught, neurologically, to find pleasure in things that require more from them. This is not a small effect. A 2019 longitudinal study from the University of Copenhagen, following children from age 3 through age 10, found that early introduction of complex and bitter flavors, combined with low added sugar exposure, was associated with significantly better scores on sustained attention tasks at age 7, and lower rates of food-related impulse dysregulation at age 10, compared to children with high early sugar exposure and limited flavor complexity. The Sardinian diet fills the developmental window not with deprivation, but with calibration. It sets the brain's reward threshold at a level that the ordinary pleasures of ordinary life can continue to meet. For practical application in a modern household, introduce bitter greens, arugula, radicchio, roasted broccoli, chicory if available, consistently from the age of 18 months onward. Not as a test and not as a force, as a regular and unremarked presence at every meal. The research on flavor preference formation is clear that repeated neutral exposure, not pressure or reward, is the mechanism of acceptance. A child who sees bitter greens on the table 40 times before age 4 will eat them. A child who sees them for the first time at age 7, after 4 years of flavor experience built around sweetness, will refuse them. And the refusal will be neurologically coherent, not willful. Both of the first 2 layers depend on a structural feature of traditional Sardinian family life that is harder to translate directly and easier to dismiss as cultural nostalgia. It deserves neither dismissal nor nostalgia. It deserves an explanation of why it works. In the Barbagia villages, the authority over young children's food is held by grandmothers. Not informally, structurally. The grandmother, nonna in Italian, but in Barbagia dialect, ia or babbai, depending on village, is understood to be the keeper of what is appropriate for young children to eat, independent of the parents' preferences, independent of the child's preferences, and independent of what is convenient. This is not a power struggle. It is a recognized role with recognized authority, and it distributes the burden of restriction away from the parents, who are the child's primary attachment figures, and onto a figure whose love is not conditional on daily comfort management. This structural design solves a specific problem that modern parents face in isolation: the cost of consistency. Maintaining a restriction against a distressed child's preference day after day is emotionally taxing. It damages the felt warmth of the parent-child relationship in small daily ways. When the restriction is enforced by the grandmother as an unquestioned cultural norm, the parent is freed from the daily negotiation. The parent remains the primary source of warmth and comfort. The grandmother holds the line. The child learns that some things are simply not available. Not because the parent is withholding love, but because that is how food works in this family. The distinction matters neurologically and behaviorally. A 2022 study in the Journal of Family Psychology, examining cross-cultural differences in food restriction enforcement, found that children in households where dietary rules were maintained consistently by a secondary authority figure, grandparent, extended family member, consistent caregiver, showed lower rates of food-related behavioral opposition and faster acquisition of intrinsic food preferences compared to children in households where the primary parent was the sole enforcer of restriction. The grandmother is not a relic. She is a system solution to a human behavioral problem that modern nuclear family structure has no equivalent mechanism for. For modern households without an available grandmother, the transferable principle is consistency enforced as culture, not as individual parental willpower. When a food restriction is explained to a child as what people in this family eat, not as what you are being denied today, the child's resistance decreases because the frame is not a negotiation, it is a description of reality. The distinction is available to any household. It requires only that the adults in the household agree on it completely and communicate it uniformly. The developmental window these practices target, 18 months to 6 years, is not a hard cutoff. Neurological plasticity continues beyond age 6, but the rate of structural change in the prefrontal cortex slows significantly after the early childhood window, and the reward calibration established in that window does not reverse easily. Children who are raised with low added sugar exposure and high flavor complexity before age 6, and who are then introduced to Western dietary patterns at school age, do not simply adopt those patterns wholesale. Research from a 2021 study in Appetite Journal, tracking Sardinian families who relocated to northern Italian cities, found that children raised in traditional Barbagia households maintained measurably different food preference profiles and lower impulsive eating scores at age 12 compared to same-age peers raised in urban dietary environments, despite 6 years of exposure to the urban food environment by the time of measurement. The window writes something that does not fully rewrite. The honest timeline for a family beginning this now. Expect resistance in the first 2 to 4 weeks. Expect that resistance to decrease significantly by week 6, as the absence of high-amplitude sugar reward stops being felt as deprivation and starts being the norm. Expect that flavor complexity acceptance for bitter and unfamiliar foods will require consistent exposure over 6 to 8 months before genuine preference begins to emerge. Not tolerance, preference. Children who grow up eating chicoria in Orgosolo do not merely tolerate it, they request it. The smallest starting action is this. Read the labels on the 5 processed foods your child eats most frequently. Remove added sugar from each of them, not by telling the child, not with a conversation about health, but simply by replacing those products, one at a time over 2 weeks, with whole food equivalents. Then add 1 bitter or complex flavor to every meal for the next 30 days, without comment, without pressure, as a regular feature of what this family eats. The Sardinian grandmothers never explained this to their grandchildren. They simply served the minestrone. The chicory was already on the table, and the children grew up to be, by every available measure of cognitive longevity and self-regulation, some of the most capable people on earth. If you recognized something in this that you want to apply, leave a comment with your child's age and which of these 3 layers feels most immediately available to you. And if the research on early dietary windows and brain development is something you want to go deeper on, subscribe. There is more from Sardinia and from other traditional communities that the longevity research has documented and the parenting world has not yet found.